Have you ever crossed paths with someone whose smile seemed almost mysterious? Not the polite grin you give at a meeting, not the forced laughter when you hear a joke you didn't find funny, but a gentle, unshakable smile. A smile that feels as if it comes from somewhere deeper than circumstance. Picture this. You're walking through a crowded city street. Cars honk. People rush by, glued to their phones. Everyone is caught in their own little storm, but then you notice someone sitting quietly on a bench. No music in their ears, no shiny gadgets in their hands, just sitting, breathing, smiling for no reason at all. It makes you pause, doesn't it? Why would someone smile when the world around them looks so heavy? Why smile when nothing special is happening? This is the silent secret of happiness. Most of us have been trained to believe that happiness needs a reason. We think we'll smile when the job promotion comes, when the bank account is full, when the perfect partner finally arrives. We bargain with life. Let me get what I want and then I'll be happy. But the truth is those smiles often don't last. The job eventually becomes stressful. The money never feels like enough. The relationship brings new challenges. And soon the smile fades, waiting for the next reason to appear. Yet some people, they don't wait. Their smile is not a reaction to life's conditions. Their smile is life itself. Buddhist wisdom tells us that true joy is not something we stumble upon when external events align. It is an inner wellspring that doesn't depend on what comes and goes. The Buddha himself was known for his gentle smile, even when speaking about suffering. It wasn't the smile of denial, nor the smile of ignoring pain. It was the smile of someone who had touched a deeper truth, that peace is possible in the very midst of life as it is. There's a famous story of a Zen master walking with his disciples on a rainy day. The students complained, "Master, the rain is ruining our clothes, it's cold, it's uncomfortable." But the master simply tilted his face to the sky, feeling the drops on his skin, and smiled. "Isn't this rain also a gift?" he asked softly. The disciples stopped. For the first time, they saw the rain differently, not as an enemy, but as life itself. And in that moment, they too began to smile. This kind of smile is not about ignoring life's struggles. It's about transcending the need for life to be perfect before we allow ourselves to feel joy. It's the smile that says, "I am here, I am alive, and that alone is enough." And here lies the paradox. When we stop chasing reasons to be happy, we often find happiness arising on its own. Like a child laughing at the shape of a cloud, like someone savoring the warmth of a cup of tea. No big achievement, no grand event, just the simple miracle of being. The modern world rarely encourages this. Everywhere we turn, we're told, buy this, achieve that, prove yourself, and then you'll smile. Yet deep down, we know the smile that needs conditions will always vanish the moment those conditions change. But the smile without reason, that is unshakable, that is free, that is the silent secret of happiness. So the question is, why do so few of us discover it? Why do so many keep chasing reasons that never satisfy? To understand that, we need to look more closely at the great illusion that has shaped our lives. The belief that happiness is always waiting somewhere outside of us. We live in a world that constantly whispers, "You'll be happy once. Once you graduate, once you get that promotion, once you buy that house, that car, that dress, once you fall in love, get married, or finally become the person you think you should be." And so we wait. We postpone happiness, tying it to conditions that may or may not come true. But here's the painful truth: when those conditions finally arrive, they rarely deliver the joy we imagined. The promotion comes, and along with it, more pressure. The new car feels exciting for a few weeks, until it just becomes another object in the garage. Even love, the most beautiful of human experiences, can fade into arguments and misunderstandings when expectations creep in. This is the mirage of conditional happiness. Like a thirsty traveler in the desert, we see an oasis shimmering in the distance. We rush toward it, desperate and hopeful, only to discover it was never really there. The Buddha once described this endless chase as tanha craving. It is the restless fire in the mind that says, not enough, more, different, better. We think if we satisfy it, the fire will finally go out, but in truth, the more we feed it, the stronger it burns. Let me tell you a story. There was once a wealthy businessman who had everything: a mansion by the sea, luxury cars, vacations in the most exotic places. Yet one night, he sat alone in his vast dining hall, staring at a golden chandelier above his head. His plate was full, but his heart was empty. Despite all he owned, he found himself whispering into the silence, "Why do I still feel so hollow?" The truth was simple. His smiles had always depended on the next deal, the next purchase, the next recognition. And once those moments passed, his happiness vanished like smoke in the wind. This is how most of us live. We smile because something happened. We laugh because someone praised us. We feel joy because life temporarily gave us what we wanted. But the moment the condition changes, the money is spent, the praise is forgotten, the success is replaced by another challenge, the happiness collapses. Conditional happiness is fragile. It is like a castle built on sand. The waves of life will always come, and when they do, the walls tumble down. And yet we cling to it. Why? Because the illusion is so convincing. We're taught from childhood that joy must be earned. A child is told, "Be good, get good grades, then you'll be rewarded." Adults are told, "Work hard, buy more, succeed more, then you'll be happy." But this constant chase only pulls us further away from the simple truth: joy doesn't need a contract. There is a story from Buddhist tradition about a farmer. One day his only horse ran away. The neighbors came and said, "What bad luck?" The farmer simply replied, "Maybe." Days later, the horse returned, bringing with it 3 wild horses. The neighbors exclaimed, "What good fortune!" And the farmer said, "Maybe." Soon after, his son tried to tame one of the wild horses and broke his leg. The neighbors cried, "How terrible!" The farmer answered, "Maybe." A week later, soldiers came to recruit young men for war, but because the son's leg was broken, he was spared. The neighbors shouted, "Such good luck!" The farmer only said, "Maybe." The farmer's calm smile showed something profound. He didn't let happiness or suffering depend on fleeting events. He saw through the illusion that fortune or misfortune could control his inner peace. This is what the world often misses. The more we chase happiness outside of ourselves, the more it slips through our fingers. Like grasping at clouds, the tighter we hold, the faster they vanish. But here is the question that truly matters. If conditional happiness is a mirage, where does real happiness come from? The answer lies not in running faster, but in stopping. Not in chasing, but in seeing. And when we begin to see clearly, something beautiful happens. Joy rises from within, without needing a reason at all. If the chase for happiness outside of ourselves is a mirage, then where can true happiness be found? Buddhism answers this question with a clarity that feels almost radical in our modern age. Real joy is not something we obtain, it is something we uncover. The Buddha once described the human mind as a lake. When desires and fears stir the surface, the water becomes muddy and restless. But when we allow stillness, when we let the ripples fade, the water clears. And in that clarity, we can see our own reflection, calm, radiant, complete. Joy is like that. It is not poured into us by the world. It is already within us, revealed when the waters of craving settle. Think of a child. A child does not need a new toy or an impressive achievement to laugh. Sometimes a simple butterfly landing on their hand is enough to bring endless delight. That is inner joy, spontaneous, unconditioned, flowing from a place untouched by the demands of more. But as we grow older, layers of expectation, ambition, and fear begin to cover this natural joy. We are taught to compare ourselves to others, to measure our worth against achievements. Slowly, the simple happiness of being alive becomes buried under a mountain of shoulds. Buddhism offers a way back. The first lesson is this: suffering comes from craving. The moment we tie our joy to something impermanent, we sign an invisible contract with disappointment. That is why conditional happiness is so fragile, because everything in life changes. Wealth fades, health shifts, relationships evolve, beauty passes. If we anchor our smile to what is constantly changing, our happiness will be as unstable as the tides. But there is another possibility: anchoring joy to what does not depend on change, to awareness itself, to presence. to the simple miracle of this breath, this step, this moment. The Buddha often spoke about sukha, a deep, stable kind of happiness that comes not from grasping but from letting go. It is not the thrill of winning, nor the temporary rush of success. It is the quiet contentment that arises when the heart rests in peace. There's a story told about the Buddha himself. Once, after a long day of teaching, he sat beneath a tree. A disciple asked him, "Master, why do you always smile, even when speaking of suffering?" The Buddha looked gently at the man and said, "Because I see clearly. Suffering exists, yes, but so does the end of suffering, and that truth is enough to smile." That smile was not born of denial. It was born of freedom. Freedom from the endless chase. Freedom from needing the world to bend perfectly before allowing oneself to be content. Modern psychology has echoed this ancient truth. Studies show that external achievements contribute far less to lasting happiness than we think. A new car, a raise, even winning the lottery, all these cause only a temporary spike in joy. But practices like gratitude, compassion, and mindfulness, the very qualities Buddhism has emphasized for thousands of years, cultivate a joy that lasts. Inner joy is not loud. It is not about fireworks or applause. It is quiet, steady, like a candle that continues to shine no matter how dark the night becomes. And when a person touches that inner joy, something remarkable happens. Their smile no longer depends on reasons. It flows naturally, like water from a hidden spring. Others feel it. Others are touched by it, because it carries the fragrance of freedom. So perhaps the question is not, how can I get what I need to be happy? But rather, what can I release? What illusions can I let go of so that the joy already within me can shine? And when we begin to ask that question, we realize that joy is not something to be hunted. It is something to be remembered. Some smiles are born from comfort. Others, surprisingly, are born from hardship. There is a quiet power in those who can smile despite circumstances, in those whose joy is not chained to life's fleeting fortunes. These are the resilient souls, the ones who have discovered that happiness is not outside but inside, and that their smile does not require permission from the world. Imagine a small village battered by storms. Homes are damaged, crops ruined, and hope seems thin. Amid the chaos, a grandmother sits on the steps of her house. She hums a gentle tune, her lips curling into a soft smile. Her neighbors watch, puzzled. How can she smile when so much is lost? She simply says, "The wind may break branches, but it cannot touch my heart. And the heart, it still has the sky." This is resilience. A smile that arises not because life is easy, but because the spirit refuses to surrender to its hardships. Buddhism calls this upekkha, often translated as equanimity. It is not indifference. It is not a cold detachment from life's trials. It is a calm, unwavering presence that allows joy to flourish even in the midst of suffering. It is the understanding that external circumstances can change at any moment, yet the heart, trained in mindfulness and compassion, can remain steady. Consider the story of a young monk who had lost his family. Poverty and loneliness surrounded him, yet every morning he greeted the sunrise with a smile. A visitor asked, "How can you smile when life has been so cruel?" The monk answered simply, "I do not smile at life. I smile with life. My heart has found a spring that the world cannot dry." Or think of someone recovering from illness. Imagine the countless days spent in pain, the nights that seemed endless. Yet one morning they notice a single leaf dancing in the sunlight, and they laugh not because the illness is gone, but because life, in its smallest detail, still exists. These stories reveal a profound truth. Joy is not always found in what happens to us. It is found in how we perceive, how we respond, how we allow our hearts to rest in the present moment. The Buddha taught that suffering is inevitable, yet so too is liberation from suffering. The same rain that ruins crops can water seeds that will grow into a forest. The same trials that test our patience can teach us the art of gratitude. When we recognize this, the smile no longer waits for perfect conditions. It becomes a natural expression of a liberated heart. Even in modern life, we can witness this. A single parent working tirelessly, exhausted at the end of each day, can still laugh with their child. A refugee who has lost almost everything can share a smile with someone in need. A teacher who faces endless challenges in a classroom can still greet each student with warmth. These smiles are not shallow. They are profound, quiet, and contagious. They touch others without words because they speak of something universal, the human spirit's capacity for joy beyond circumstance. And there's a subtle lesson here, one that Buddhism emphasizes gently but insistently. The more we resist life's challenges, the more we suffer. The more we accept, observe, and cultivate mindfulness, the freer our joy becomes. A smile, then, is not just an expression of happiness. It is a mark of resilience, a sign that the soul has chosen peace over despair. When we begin to notice these resilient smiles around us, we start to see life differently. We begin to understand that joy does not arrive only after the storm passes. Sometimes, it is there in the very midst of the storm, quiet, unwavering, waiting for us to open our hearts. And as we watch these smiles, as we feel their quiet strength, we are invited to try the same, to notice life's beauty even when it seems impossible, to nurture our own inner spring, to remember that a smile need not have a reason, because joy itself can be the reason. In that quiet realization, a seed is planted, the seed of possibility, that we too can learn to smile beyond circumstance, that we too can touch the freedom that resilient souls carry in every unspoken gesture. Happiness in the world as we know it often comes with a condition. We are trained to believe that life must hand us reasons before we allow ourselves to smile. Earn it, achieve it, acquire it. This subtle instruction has shaped generations, and yet it quietly binds our joy to circumstances we cannot control. Consider the irony. The very things we chase to make us happy often keep happiness just out of reach. The raise we long for arrives, but soon the excitement fades. The vacation we've dreamed of ends and we return to the same worries. We wait for the next reason, the next milestone, the next perfect moment, and happiness remains suspended, always slightly ahead, never fully present. This is the trap. It is invisible yet deeply familiar. It whispers, "Not now, wait. You'll smile when the time is right." And so we spend years, decades even, postponing joy for conditions that may never align. Modern society is a master of this trap. Advertising and social media constantly suggest that happiness comes from external achievements, a new phone, a new relationship, a new status. Likes, comments, and approvals become the currency of joy. Yet these are fleeting, temporary, and outside our control. The moment the validation disappears, the smile fades. Let me tell you a story. A young woman scrolled endlessly through social media, measuring her worth against the curated lives of others. She believed she could only be happy when her life looked as perfect as those images. One day, she received a promotion she had worked years for, a moment she thought would bring lasting joy. But when she looked around, the office felt the same, the pressures remained, and her smile, though there for a moment, quickly disappeared. She realized painfully that she had spent years chasing reasons to be happy that had always been illusions. Buddhism offers a profound insight here. The mind that seeks external reasons to be happy is like a bird trapped in a cage, pecking at the bars instead of discovering the door that is already open. The cage is our attachment to conditions, our insistence that life must be just so before we allow ourselves joy. When we chase reasons, we also cultivate discontent. Every unmet expectation becomes a source of suffering. Every comparison to others, a subtle erosion of our peace. We forget that life is not a series of checkpoints to happiness. It is a continuous flow, alive and present in every breath. The path out of this trap begins with awareness. First, we must notice the subtle contract we make with life. I will be happy only if. Then, with gentle mindfulness, we can begin to release it. This does not mean ignoring challenges or denying desires. It means understanding that joy is not contingent upon their fulfillment. It is a freedom that exists independent of circumstance. Stories from Buddhist practice illuminate this truth beautifully. There was a monk who lived in extreme poverty with nothing more than a simple robe and a bowl. Visitors often asked, "How do you find joy with so little?" He would smile and reply, "I do not rely on possessions to make me happy. Happiness is my nature, not my circumstances." His smile was unwavering, radiant, and contagious, proof that joy can arise even when the world offers no apparent reason. Even small daily practices can begin to dissolve the trap. Gratitude, mindful breathing, and gentle reflection allow us to reconnect with what is always present, the simple miracle of being alive. By noticing the warmth of sunlight on our skin, the rhythm of our own breath, the sound of leaves in the wind, we cultivate a happiness that does not wait for permission. The trap of seeking reasons to be happy is not something we must fight with force. It is something we must see clearly, understand fully, and gently step away from. Once we do, a remarkable thing happens. Joy begins to emerge, unbidden and effortless. It arises because it is our natural state, not because life has given us a reason. And in that space, we begin to smile freely, not at life's gifts or achievements, but simply at the wonder of being. Have you ever noticed how tightly we clutch life? Our desires, our expectations, our need for certainty, we hold them as if letting go would mean losing everything. And yet in that grasping, we discover the opposite. Our joy slips away. Buddhism invites us into a radical idea. True freedom, true happiness, arises when we embrace emptiness not as nothingness, but as the absence of clinging. The term is sunyata, a profound understanding that nothing in the world exists independently. Everything is interconnected, impermanent, and constantly changing. When we see life this way, the very things we thought we needed to hold on to lose their power to trap us. Consider the lotus flower. It grows in muddy water, yet it rises untainted above the surface. Its beauty is not dependent on the clarity of the water, nor on the care of the gardener. It simply blooms. So too can our happiness bloom, not because conditions are perfect, but because we recognize that nothing outside can define our inner peace. There is a story of an old monk, sitting quietly in his monastery, living with almost nothing. A young disciple asked him, "Master, how do you stay so peaceful with so little?" The monk smiled gently and replied, "I have nothing to hold and therefore nothing to lose. Everything is a gift, everything passes, and in this I am free." This wisdom of emptiness does not mean we abandon life or reject its beauty. It means we participate fully without attachment, without demanding that the world meet our expectations. It is the difference between dancing with the music and trying to control every note. Imagine a traveler walking along a mountain path. Storm clouds gather. The wind bites. The traveler could curse the storm, wish it away, and feel frustrated. Or they could notice the sharp scent of rain, the way the wind brushes their face, the thrill of moving through nature's unpredictability. In that moment, there is no need to fight, no need to grasp, just pure presence. And in presence, joy often arises naturally. This is why a smile without reason becomes possible. When we let go of attachment to outcomes, when we accept the impermanence of everything around us, our heart is free to express itself. Happiness no longer depends on approval, possession, or perfection. It flows spontaneously, like a spring that has never known drought. Even in everyday life, this wisdom applies. Losing a job, a relationship, or even a prized possession may feel devastating. But when we see that nothing is truly permanent and that our essence is not tied to any of these fleeting events, a quiet relief emerges. The heart relaxes, the mind softens, and suddenly a smile appears, not because life has given us a reason, but because we have discovered freedom within. Buddhism calls this upekkha, equanimity, the balanced mind that neither clings to joy nor resists sorrow. It is a smile born from seeing clearly. Life is change, suffering is inevitable, but inner freedom is always available. When we embrace emptiness, we also embrace connection. We see that our happiness is not separate from the world, but interwoven with it. The smile we carry can ripple outward, touching others in ways we cannot measure. The freedom we discover within allows us to meet life fully, the joys and the pains, with an open heart. Nothing to hold, nothing to lose. This is not an abstract teaching. It is a practical path. A path toward a smile that needs no reason, a joy that is unshakable, a life lived fully in the present. And in this understanding we come closer to the heart of the teaching. The reasonless smile is not just a gift to ourselves. It is a reflection of the deep, quiet wisdom that has guided sages, monks, and resilient souls throughout history. Have you ever noticed how a simple smile can change the energy of a room? It doesn't need words. It doesn't need explanation. It doesn't even need reason. A smile can ripple through hearts, soften tensions, and awaken a sense of calm in others. This is the power of joy born from inner peace. Buddhism teaches that our mind is not isolated. Everything we feel, think, and express affects the world around us. When our hearts are free, when our smiles are unconditioned, their influence is profound, subtle, yet transformative. Consider the story of Thich Nhat Hanh 5T H 1E1NH, the great Vietnamese Zen master. People would visit him, burdened with worry, grief, or anger. And often, before any advice was given, before any teaching, they would notice his smile. Quiet, gentle, unwavering. That smile alone carried the presence of peace, inviting others to release their tension, to remember that calm is possible even amidst chaos. There is a modern phenomenon that mirrors this ancient truth, the contagious smile. Researchers have found that when one person smiles genuinely, it triggers automatic reactions in the brain of those around them, often causing others to smile without thinking. In other words, joy begets joy, peace begets peace. And this is no coincidence. It is a reflection of the interconnectedness Buddhism has always pointed to. Even small, everyday moments reveal this power. A barista greets a tired customer with warmth. A child laughs at a parent's gentle tease. A stranger holds a door with a soft smile. These small acts, though seemingly trivial, ripple outward, touching hearts and sometimes changing entire days. The true miracle is that this power does not require perfection or ideal circumstances. It does not wait for approval, recognition, or reward. A smile that arises from inner freedom is like sunlight piercing through clouds, effortless, undeniable, life-giving. Stories from monasteries, schools, and hospitals all tell the same truth. When individuals cultivate inner peace, their presence becomes magnetic. Their laughter, their calm demeanor, their unforced smiles act as quiet reminders that life can be embraced, not feared, that suffering can exist, yet joy can also bloom. Think of the simplest moments in your own life. Perhaps a friend smiled at you unexpectedly, and for a brief instant, the weight of your worries lifted. Perhaps a teacher's gentle approval gave you courage. Perhaps you saw a stranger smile at another stranger, and for a moment the world felt lighter. This is the power of joy that needs no reason. It spreads without effort, and yet it changes everything. Buddhism emphasizes that this outward ripple is inseparable from the inner source. We cannot genuinely share peace if we have not found it within ourselves. This is why the practice of mindfulness, meditation, and compassionate living is so essential. When we cultivate stillness, gratitude, and awareness, our smiles are no longer dependent on the world, they become a gift to the world. And here's the subtle wonder. By letting our inner peace shine outward, we reinforce it within ourselves. The smile we offer returns not as ego or pride, but as confirmation of the freedom we have discovered. It is a cycle of joy, effortless and eternal. The world may never hand us reasons to smile. Circumstances may challenge us. People may disappoint us, but the inner smile born of understanding, presence, and freedom remains. It reaches beyond obstacles, beyond suffering, beyond fear. And in its quiet power, it can awaken countless hearts, one unspoken gesture at a time. This is the profound alchemy of joy. It begins inside, and it radiates outward, transforming lives in ways words often cannot describe. The beauty of a smile that needs no reason is that it is accessible to anyone, yet most of us overlook it. We wait for life to give us permission. We wait for the perfect moment, the ideal circumstance. But the truth is, the power to smile freely already exists within us. Buddhism offers timeless guidance on how to awaken this inner joy. The first step is awareness. Simply noticing life moment by moment opens the door to effortless smiles. Mindfulness is not about escaping reality. It is about meeting it fully, the sights, the sounds, the sensations, and realizing that in this meeting, joy can arise spontaneously. Imagine beginning your day with a single conscious breath. Inhale, feeling life itself filling you. Exhale, releasing tension, expectation, and the need for external approval. Let a smile form naturally on your lips, not as a reaction, but as a recognition of being alive. This is smiling meditation, a practice taught by many Zen masters. A simple, quiet gesture, yet profoundly transformative. Gratitude is another powerful path. Take a moment each day to notice small gifts, the warmth of sunlight, the taste of food, the presence of a friend. By acknowledging these ordinary miracles, you cultivate a mind that does not wait for extraordinary reasons to feel joy. Happiness, in this sense, is less about adding more and more about fully noticing what already exists. Compassion, too, nourishes the reasonless smile. When we reach out to others, even in subtle ways, the heart opens. A kind word, a gentle gesture, a listening ear, these acts create a connection that mirrors back joy. The Buddha often taught that the happiness of others is inseparable from our own. A genuine smile shared with another becomes a loop, a ripple of freedom that spreads far beyond the moment. Practicality does not end with meditation or mindful awareness. Daily rituals reinforce the habit of inner joy. Start your day with a smile in the mirror, a small act of acknowledgement that you are here, alive, and capable of joy. Walk with awareness, noticing the rhythm of your steps, the air on your skin, the life all around. Let your smile accompany this movement. When faced with challenges, pause. Instead of reacting with frustration or fear, take a breath, observe, and allow a gentle smile to emerge. Even a subtle curve of the lips can shift your inner state. Storytelling provides another reminder. There is a woman who walks the streets of her city every morning. She carries nothing but kindness in her heart and a soft smile on her lips. People notice. Strangers feel lighter in her presence. A momentary glance, a small exchange, and for seconds the world feels a little gentler. She does not need recognition, reward, or reason. Her joy is complete in its simplicity. Even the most chaotic day offers opportunities. A traffic jam becomes a chance to breathe and observe. A spilled coffee becomes a reminder of impermanence. A heated argument can teach patience. When life is met with awareness and a gentle smile, challenges no longer dictate our happiness, we do. Ultimately, cultivating a reasonless smile is about reclaiming what was always yours: freedom. Freedom from waiting, from chasing, from measuring life by external standards. The smile that arises from this freedom is radiant, infectious, and unwavering. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that happiness is not a distant goal. It is not a reward to be earned. It is already present, waiting for us to notice, to nurture, and to let it shine. This is the practice, the path, and the gift. A smile without reason is not just an expression. It is a declaration of inner freedom. Life has a way of testing us. Pain, loss, uncertainty, these are the storms that seem to batter our spirit, challenging us to the core. Yet within these very struggles, the seeds of transformation lie hidden, waiting for the heart to awaken. There is a profound truth in Buddhism. Suffering is not the enemy of joy. In fact, it can be its doorway. When we stop resisting life's difficulties, when we meet them with awareness and acceptance, we discover that freedom and a smile that needs no reason is possible even in the darkest moments. Consider the story of a young man who had lost everything he loved. His family, his home, and his career were gone, leaving him feeling broken and defeated. One evening, sitting alone in the ruins of what had been his life, he noticed a small bird perched on a nearby branch. It sang despite the darkness, despite the storm. He laughed softly, a sound that surprised him, a spark of life rising in a heart weighed down by grief. That simple moment became the beginning of his transformation. Buddhism teaches that this spark is always within us. It is the unshakable awareness that life is impermanent, and yet within impermanence there is freedom. Every challenge, every hardship, every moment of suffering carries the opportunity to awaken the heart. Stories from the monasteries echo this truth. Monks who endure long hours of meditation, austerity, and solitude often emerge with smiles that glow from within. Why? Because they have touched the essence of being beyond the reach of circumstances. Their struggles have not defeated them. They have refined them, deepened their insight, and revealed the simplicity of joy. Even outside monasteries, ordinary people experience this transformation. A mother facing relentless exhaustion with her children may discover a moment of profound peace in a child's laughter. A person recovering from illness may find joy not in the restoration of health alone, but in the awareness of each breath, each heartbeat, each sunrise. The smile that emerges is not a reaction to comfort, but a reflection of resilience, clarity, and acceptance. Transformation often begins with small steps. It begins with noticing the present, letting go of the past, and releasing the anxiety of the future. It begins with allowing a gentle smile to emerge, even when life feels heavy. That smile, humble and authentic, signals the first taste of freedom, the recognition that joy is not something we earn, but something we uncover within ourselves. One striking lesson from Buddhist teachings is the story of Kisa Gautami. She lost her young son and was consumed by grief. Seeking a way to bring him back, she approached the Buddha. He instructed her to find a mustard seed from a household untouched by death. She discovered, in her search, that no household had escaped suffering. Through this understanding, she realized that loss and pain are universal, and in that recognition, she found compassion, acceptance, and the ability to smile again, not because her suffering vanished, but because her heart had awakened to the truth of life. This is the essence of transformation. It does not erase struggle, but it changes our relationship with it. The hardships of life become teachers. The weight of suffering becomes a doorway to freedom. And through this freedom, the heart naturally expresses itself in a reasonless smile, one that is grounded, radiant, and resilient. The world may continue to challenge us. Storms will come, loss will visit, and uncertainty will knock at our doors. But the smile born from transformation, from meeting life fully, without grasping or resisting, is unshakable. It is the quiet proof that liberation is always within reach. As we witness these stories, both ancient and modern, we begin to understand. Joy without reason is not a myth. It is the reward of courage, mindfulness, and the willingness to face life as it is. And as we take these lessons into our own hearts, we discover that freedom, resilience, and reasonless happiness are not distant ideals. They are alive, here, and waiting for us to embrace. And so, here we arrive at the quiet revelation that has been waiting for us all along. A smile born not from circumstance, not from achievement, not from permission, is the purest reflection of freedom. It is a smile that arises when the heart rests in presence, when the mind lets go of craving, when the soul remembers its own boundless nature. Imagine carrying that smile with you into each day, through the noise, the challenges, the ordinary moments that often pass unnoticed. It changes everything. Not by altering the world around you, but by transforming the world within. It is a subtle alchemy, a gentle revolution, a whisper of the truth that joy is not something to earn, but something to uncover. Every breath becomes an invitation, every glance a reminder, every moment a chance to practice the art of reasonless joy. And in doing so, you discover something remarkable. The smile that needs no reason is also the smile that never fades. This journey from chasing reasons to touching the depths of inner joy to sharing it freely with the world is not a destination. It is a living, breathing practice, a dance between awareness and presence, surrender and awakening. And the beauty is that it is always available, always here, always now. If this message resonated with you, and if you feel the quiet stirrings of that reasonless smile within your own heart, we invite you to walk this path with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more insights, stories, and reflections on living a life of mindful joy and inner freedom. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that happiness is not something to chase, but something to remember. And as you go forward, carry the smile that needs no reason, a smile that whispers gently to the world. Peace is possible, joy is always within reach, and your heart is already enough. May your smile shine freely and effortlessly in every moment.